Ray Gunn, member of our group, retired professor from the University of Utah, has volunteered to talk about fake history. If you will recall, those of you who have been attending the meetings, earlier this year, I believe in January, we had George Pyle, the editorial chief for the Salt Lake Tribune, and he talked about fake news. Fake news can turn into fake history. So I think for a number of reasons it's important to discuss this, and Ray certainly has the background and the experience to deal with this subject. Ray, I'm going to suggest to the group that they hold their questions until after. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
We didn't have a chance to talk.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so if you let Ray complete his comments and remarks, and then he'll welcome your questions. The way that we're going to do this, if you do have questions at the right time, just raise your hand and I'll run around with this mic while Ray uses this one up in front. And with that, here's Professor Emeritus, University of Utah, History, Ray Gunn. Thank you, Ray. Go ahead.
Oh, is this working? No. How do I do this? Turn it on. That would help. Can you hear me now? Okay.
You got it.
I would probably rather use that.
Okay, just so you know, you're gonna have to give this one up.
That's fine.
And
I
then turn
can,
it
I can
down.
walk up and
Okay.
down once we have.
All right, here we go.
This good now? Okay. Well, first of all, I almost didn't make it, okay? It took me almost an hour to get here. Foothill and I-80. Stuck for 30 minutes on the I-80 before I could get to any place I could get off. But I'm delighted to be here, and I hope I didn't give Don too much of a scare having to step in and ad-lib this morning. I'm certainly delighted to be able to talk to you about history this morning. Fake history, real history, whatever it might turn out to be. Let me say at the beginning two things. One, I'm going to try to keep my comments to about 35 minutes, give or take 2 or 3, in one direction or the other. And I know that when Rabbi Wenger was here, he made the point that he always over-prepares. He's nothing compared to me in that regard, I don't think. So the other thing I want to very quickly mention is that I've taken the liberty of slightly broadening the topic. The topic, as was announced, is fake history, and it will be that, but the full title is Fake History, the Use and the Misuse of the Past. Now, Don mentioned the session you had with George Pyle some time ago. Not long after that, he suggested to me, that is, Don suggested to me the possibility of a session on fake history. And when he did so, I confess I wasn't really sure that that necessarily would be a good idea or would work. But just a few days after that, I happened to stumble upon an article entitled, "First Fake News, Now Fake History." According to the article, Glenn Beck and a self-described historian by the name of David Barton are planning to offer a 2-week program for $350 a head for high school graduates to prepare them with real history before they are exposed to the bogus history that they're going to get from their college professors. Now, according to Barton's real history, founding fathers already had the debate over creation versus evolution, and they chose creationism, which is remarkable since The Origin of the Species wasn't published until 1859. He also claims that the Earth is 6,000 years old. The Constitution was founded on the Bible, and the American colonies wanted to separate from Britain so they could end slavery, which is really remarkable since it took them another 7 or 8 decades to do that. Now, I'm not planning to dwell on Mr. Beck or Mr. Barton here this morning, but as someone who has been disseminating what they regard as fake history in a university for almost 50 years, I thought I should weigh in. First, a word about history itself. What is it? Well, at the simplest level, at one level, it is, in fact, simply the story of the past. But it doesn't take even a minute to realize that we cannot and never will know everything that ever happened in the past. So at best, history is that portion of the past for which some kind of credible evidence has survived. And even that's too broad. There has to be some selection. What part of the past is important? What actors in the past are important? Now, until about the 1960s, which is about when I started seriously studying history, date me a little bit, history as it was taught and written was mostly about politics and war. It was mostly about great men and a few great women. It was about kings and queens, military leaders, politicians, elites. Then, again, about the 1960s or so, there were some predecessors, but about the 1960s or so, we began to see other people as actors in the past. Minorities, women, non-elites, history from the bottom up, as historian Jesse Linish put it famously. This was a broadening of the legitimate subjects of historical study, and that broadening produced, literally, a revolution in historical analysis. Of course, there remain differences of interpretation among historians. There's no question about that. But history, and this is the point I really want to emphasize, history is an evidence-based discipline. We can't replicate experiments the way scientists do, the way physicists or chemists or whomever do. We can't do that. The past is the past. But we operate within generally accepted canons of scholarship. Unlike a novelist, we can't just make it up. We can't just make it up. How do we prevent that? Well, we have peer review and other kinds of checks on professional historians and their output, okay? The best journals and the best presses who publish history, for example, typically use blind reviewers. I wrote a book some years ago, Cornell University Press, sent it out to 2 or 3 people. I had no idea who they were. I found out later, just because they didn't mind, but normally completely blind, okay? We have a process called book reviewing. All major journals review books, and some of them are very, very critical. We have professional organizations that have professional standards that we are all held to. In colleges and universities, we have promotion and tenure review processes. For example, if you want to be promoted to associate professor or to full professor at the University of Utah or any other history department, your material will be sent out, your books and articles will be sent out to anywhere from 3 to 7 scholars. Again, blind. You're not supposed to know who they are. Okay, so there are mechanisms by which we can check that and ensure that historians, professional historians, trained historians, in fact abide by the canons of historical scholarship. Now, there's a lot of bad, incorrect, or misleading history out there in our culture. But I wouldn't characterize it all as fake history. I reserve that term for versions of the past which have been deliberately manipulated or fabricated for the purposes of misleading or misinforming the audience for some specific purpose. Often, not always, but often a political purpose. Imagine for the moment a spectrum. I think there's a spectrum here, okay? And you can put some of this misleading and bad history on that spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, there is history that is bad due to simple ignorance or error. There is up in Midway. How many of you have ever been to the Memorial Hill Veterans Monument up in Midway, on top of that hill? A few of you. It's a beautiful monument, series of monuments to the various people who have fought and died in America's various wars. I was up there a couple of years ago and was astonished to find that the plaque commemorating those people in the first Gulf War states that in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iran army marched into Kuwait and to help preserve a burgeoning republic. Now, I think we all know that Saddam Hussein was Iraqi, not Iranian. Now, whoever wrote that, I think, was either ignorant of the difference between Iran and Iraq, or simply made a typographical error. Kuwait's also misspelled, by the way. And maybe both, but I don't think there was a nefarious purpose to it. They didn't deliberately do that, but there it sits, and it's probably going to be there for a very, very long time. Let me give you another example, which is not quite so innocent. Have any of you ever been to Alamo, Idaho? I've yet to find anybody that has. I guess I haven't either. I'm going to have to go up there one of these days. Well, in Alamo, Idaho, there's a monument to the 294 whites massacred by Indians in 1861. The problem is there is not a single shred of evidence that any such thing ever happened. There's an oral tradition, but there's no evidence. In fact, a former colleague of mine, Brig Matson, anybody ever run into Brig Matson, the legend at the university for many, many years? Anyway, Brigham Matson, a very, very good Western historian, probably more than 25 years ago, pointed out that this monument was erected in 1938 in Alamo, Idaho, as part of an effort to attract tourists by having that part of Idaho designated as a national monument and to get funding for a major local development project. He was persona non grata, by the way. I actually heard him being interviewed on NPR about that, and he said, "Yeah, they don't like me much up there anymore." But he was a very fine scholar. He had spent 40 years studying, Indian and white clashes and battles and things in the West, and so his scholarship, it's in Idaho yesterday, if anybody wants to look that up. Another example, and there are many, many examples. In 1916, the United Daughters of the Confederacy dedicated a monument in Helena, Montana, in, quote, loving tribute to our Confederate soldiers, end quote. Even though there was neither a Helena nor a Montana at the time of the Civil War. I encourage you to take a look at Tony Horwitz's book sometime called Confederates in the Attic. It's quite fascinating. He brought that to my attention. If you read that, it's a great book. There are also what we might call distortions of history by omission. How many of you have ever been to the Shields sporting goods stores at 114th South? If you go in the south entrance, you see this actually quite nice statue of Abraham Lincoln sitting on a bench, right? And then there's a plaque next to it. That accompanying plaque summarizes Lincoln's career in about 300 plus words, but includes not a single mention of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, or even the old cliche that Lincoln freed the slaves. By the way, they also don't mention the fact that he served one term in Congress and was a vehement opponent of the Mexican War. Now, Shields is a private entity, so they can put up whatever they want to put up. But, as a historian, I have to think that somebody somewhere made a conscious decision to acknowledge Lincoln, but at the same time omit any mention whatsoever of slavery, which is pretty hard to do. Pretty hard to do. Monuments and historical markers are particularly interesting in that regard, as a matter of fact. And there are many, many examples of this. I just picked a few. North of Memphis, Tennessee, for example, there is a historical marker commemorating the April 12, 1864 victory of General Nathan Bedford Forrest over Union forces at Fort Pillow. And the monument says, they did that to prevent the Union depredations in the area, and X numbers of Union soldiers were killed. There is, however, no mention of the fact that Forrest men massacred scores, possibly hundreds, of surrendered Union soldiers, mostly black soldiers. No mention of that. In fact, there are more historical markers to General Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee than there are of any other national political figure in their home states, including Washington, Jefferson, and so forth, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Now, the fact is that statues, monuments, historical markers often give the image or the pretense of being totally accurate, but are not necessarily always accurate according to professional historians. They are indeed sometimes, like that one, notable for what they don't say. Again, many examples, but let me give you this one. Again, brought to my attention by James Lowen in the book some of you may have read, which is Lies My Teachers Taught Me. Somebody last time I was here mentioned that. Yeah,
that was a great book.
Yeah, I read that. Okay. You know, each state has the right to put up 2 statues in the U.S. Capitol. And in 2009, Alabama actually took one of theirs down and replaced it with a statue of Helen Keller. And it's a very nice statue of a young 7-year-old girl standing next to a water pump, which is, of course, referencing when her teacher first broke through when she began to understand language. Keller, of course, had been blind and deaf and unable to speak from age about 19 months or so. But interestingly, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of notable for what we sometimes leave out, there's no reference there, and there's no reference at her home, which has been preserved in Alabama, to the fact that as an adult, it's like Helen Keller stopped at age 7, right? As an adult, Helen Keller was a radical socialist, a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, pro-abortion, helped found the American Civil Liberties Union, spoke out and advocated for women's rights, and supported the socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs for president. Now, the monument, I mean, the statue was fine. There's a nice quote from her there, and so on. I'm just saying that often more is left out than is revealed. And there are, again, many, many examples. Another category of incorrect history is what I would call national mythology. I'm not going to belabor the point. Many of you probably heard most of this. But the fact is, there's no evidence that Betsy Ross had anything to do with making the first flag. That was a story told by her grandson in Philadelphia 100 years later. It may be true, it may not be true, but there's no evidence of it. Okay. Certainly the Washington cherry tree story that we've all heard was fabricated by Parson Weems. As it happens, Parson Weems also fabricated the story of Washington praying in the snow at Valley Forge, which has been immortalized in Arnold Freeberg's famous painting that many people are familiar with. Don recently referred me to an interesting article on the presidential oath. These days, presidents typically follow the constitutional oath with the words, "So help me God." Those words are not in the official constitutional oath. And many people have argued that this was a precedent that was established by George Washington in 1789. What's the origin of that? Well, the origin of that particular story was a tale told by Washington Irving about 75 years later, almost 75 years later, in the 1850s. He claimed that as a 6-year-old boy, he had attended Washington's inauguration and heard him say it. And that is the entirety of the evidence for it. And in the 19th century, some presidents did, other presidents didn't. Since about Franklin Roosevelt, most presidents have, but it's not part of the official oath. In short, the point I'm trying to make as quickly as I can here is simply that American culture is permeated by bad history, poorly researched books and articles, TV, mythology, or I should say, well, mythology, monuments, historical markers, historical movies. Two of the most famous such movies, of course, are Birth of a Nation, not the more recent one, but the one that was done by D.W. Griffith in 1915, which is brilliant cinematography and awful history. But another one you might not have thought of in that regard, Gone with the Wind, 1939. And there's some others which are more recent that we can talk about later if you want. Mississippi Burning, even the recent Selma movie, even Steven Spielberg's Lincoln that came out a couple of years ago, and so on. Now, these sorts of things are really annoying to professional historians, partly because these days, clearly, more people get their history from popular culture than from school or serious historical works. And that can be pretty annoying. But there are far more consequential examples of that kind of bad history throughout history. Let me give you a couple of really older ones. One was something called the donation of Constantine. Anybody ever heard of that? The donation of Constantine? Well, this was a document purporting to be from the 4th century, wherein the Roman Emperor Constantine, the first official Christian emperor, had granted vast lands and political authority to the then Pope Sylvester. Now this becomes very important and very significant in later battles over political dominance between the Catholic Church on the one hand and secular authorities on the other hand. Okay? However, in the 15th century, it was proven to be a forgery. It was not real. It had in fact been written in the 8th century. Perfect, very famous example, partly because Lorenzo Valla, who found out it was a forgery, was one of the leading lights of the early Renaissance. Another example, which you probably have heard of, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Yeah, this was a document which claimed to be a report of a meeting of Jewish leaders in 1897 scheming in effect to take over rule of the world. It became, and still is in some circles, a key document supporting anti-Semitism. Turns out it was forged by the Russian secret police. Henry Ford, actually, who notoriously was anti-Semitic, had 500,000 copies of it printed and distributed. We all know about the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in our past who routinely fabricate or manipulate history for their own political purposes. Nazi Germany, of course, is a classic example. In fact, the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, is almost synonymous with fake history, if you will, and propaganda. Soviet Union, you know the Soviet Union under Stalin and others, the same thing. And you know, somebody fell out of favor, one of the leaders fell out of favor, they just sort of disappeared, even from the photographs. You know, and criminologists made a specialty out of it, you know, observing who stood on the platform at military parades and so on, and how close to the leader they stood to figure out where they stood and so forth and so on. Communist China, obviously, did the same thing. They just did it recently. Just the other day there was a story about one of the prominent up-and-coming Chinese communist authorities who was the mayor of, I can't remember the name of the city now, but a city of 30 million, fell out of grace and has basically disappeared and is being written out of all of the Communist Party documents. And of course, North Korea, we know, notorious for this sort of thing as well. Nor should we forget the Holocaust deniers, who remain all too prevalent among us today. Even slightly more mainstream political leaders can be guilty. Last April, during the French presidential election, Marine Le Pen insisted that France was not responsible for the infamous July 1942 roundup in which French police arrested more than 13,000 Jews and shipped them off to Auschwitz and other death camps. Now, there's no doubt among professional historians that that is true, and indeed, just last week, the new President Macron countered that by admitting, when not Netanyahu was there, admitting French complicity in that terrible event. To this day, the Japanese are bitterly divided over how to present the history of Japan's complicity for World War II. Conservative groups in Japan and some past governments have manipulated history textbooks, which are required to be used, to downplay Japan's responsibility for the war and to downplay their responsibility for atrocities such as the rape of Nanking, biological experiments in Manchuria, and of course the use of Korean and other comfort women for the pleasure of the Japanese army. To their credit, there are and always have been historians in Japan who have resisted this. But this denial on the part of many Japanese remains to this very day a point of diplomatic dispute between Japan and China and between Japan and South Korea. It's a major, major issue. But South Korea has also been guilty. The former dictator, Park Chung-hee, issued government history textbooks to justify his dictatorial rule. After his fall, his successors reversed that practice. Then, when his daughter, Park Geun-hye, and I'm probably mispronouncing all of these, when she became president a while back, she moved to once again rewrite the history books, only to be thwarted when she was recently impeached and charged with corruption. And the new South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, again changed the government's version. Now his spokesman, and I couldn't agree with this more, his spokesman said, quote, history education should no longer be abused by political motives, end quote. Now, Americans like to pretend that we don't do these sorts of things, but of course we do. Maybe not as heavy-handed. Liberals and conservatives accuse each other of manipulating, revising, or misrepresenting American history for their own political purposes. In fact, our national history has long been contested ground, and professional historians often find themselves caught up in these culture wars. Let me begin with a relatively small but nevertheless important issue or example. In 2010, a historian at William and Mary College, Carol Sheriff, was shocked to discover that her daughter's 4th grade History of Virginia textbook claimed that thousands of slaves had voluntarily fought in the Confederate Army. Carol Sheriff happened to be a very fine historian. Well, this is simply not true. All reputable Civil War historians know that it's not true. And it turned out that the historian who wrote, I shouldn't say that, the author of that 4th grade Virginia history textbook is in fact not a historian, and got this particular piece of fake history from the Sons of Confederate Veterans website. Brother. Now, clearly this particular incident is not exactly an earth-shattering example, but it is symptomatic of something much more important. More than 150 years after Appomattox, many Americans simply refused to accept the overwhelming scholarly consensus that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. They refused to accept it despite the fact that in 1860 and 61, Southern leaders like Jefferson Davis, future president, like Alexander Stephens, future vice president, delegates to the secession conventions, official documents from the secession conventions, secession commissioners who were sent to other states to convince them to secede, all said that the preservation of slavery was the reason they wanted to secede from the Union. In fact, very few issues in American history have been more illustrative of the fake history phenomenon than the Civil War and Reconstruction. And that's not by accident. For decades after the war, ex-Confederates, Southern apologists, and organizations like the United Confederate Veterans, of which my great-grandfather was a member, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Sons of Confederate Veterans, and others, consciously promulgated what we've come to call the myth of the lost cause, a highly romanticized view of the Old South and of slavery, of the so-called heroic efforts of the Confederacy during the war against insurmountable northern odds, and a grossly distorted view of the Reconstruction experience after the war. Now, it's interesting because winners usually write the history. If you think about history, it's usually the winners who write it. Not so in this case. In this instance, the losers, literally, dominated the historical narrative about the Civil War and Reconstruction for nearly a century. I was taught the Southern view of the Civil War and Reconstruction in my little high school in segregated East Texas. And it actually was several years into college before I learned something different. Echoes of that narrative continue to roil our political discourse today. including our understanding of the role of slavery, Confederacy, and even more deeply, racism in American history. Hardly a week passes, in fact, I think you could probably say hardly a day passes, without another confrontation over public monuments honoring Confederate heroes, public schools and streets named for Confederate leaders, and the whole controversial issue of the display of the Confederate flag. You ever wonder why almost all of the U.S. Army military facilities in the South are named after Confederate generals? I can't think of another instance in history where that would be true. It's kind of interesting. Pushing on, and I do want to leave give another 5 or 6 or 7 minutes. I want to leave lots of time for talk. Here's some other examples of some of the ways history has been misused. I sort of try to categorize these because they don't quite fall into the category of fake history, but they are examples, I think, of the misuse of history. One is historical analogies. And the two that very quickly come to my mind in that regard, because I sort of lived during this period, are the Munich analogy. Remember, supposedly the democratic countries of particularly Britain and France refused to stand up to Hitler at Munich in 1938, kind of gave in to him, appeased him, as the saying goes, and the lesson is you have to stand up to aggressors. Well, true, but that Munich analogy was also used by a lot of people to justify our role in a totally different situation, i.e. the Vietnam War, number one. And number two, related to that, the who lost China analogy or debate. After China fell to the communists in 1949, Republicans used the opportunity to charge that it was the Democratic administration of Harry Truman who had lost China. Well, of course, it was never ours to lose, but nevertheless, it becomes a very powerful political theme, if you will. Okay, and I'll tell you that both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were very, very acutely conscious of that. Johnson said, I'm not going to be the next president to lose another part of Asia to the communists, because he knew that he ran the risk of being criticized for doing that. Another example is what I call the textbook wars. We mentioned the 4th grade Virginia history textbook case back in 2010, but the issue is a whole lot larger than that. The content of new textbooks is inevitably contested whenever states adopt new history textbooks. Some of you might be teachers and you know this, okay? Usually what happens is conservatives and liberals line up over what should be, and professional historians line up on what should or should not be in such history textbooks. And one of the interesting things about that is that these battles typically center on Texas and California. Why? Because of the size of the textbook market. Between the two, you've got about 60 million people. And so textbook publishers want to have history textbooks that are satisfactory in Texas and California, because they don't want to have to write new textbooks for half a dozen or another 48 different states, if you will. And so every year that this happens, there are huge battles over what should or should not be included in those textbooks. With liberals saying there ought to be more attention to minorities and women and these kinds of things, and conservatives usually saying no, you're emphasizing them to the exclusion of enough attention to our great heroes like Washington or whomever. Related to this was a controversy that swirled around in the 1990s. How many of you remember this? The battle over the proposed national history standards. Nobody? How quickly we forget a few people. When historians and professional organizations proposed a set of minimum standards for the teaching of American history and the teaching of world history, conservatives fought them tooth and nail and won. I mean, these were minimal standards. I'm reluctant to compare it to the Common Core controversy, but it has some comparative value there. I reviewed those standards very closely myself. I knew personally one of the leaders of that movement, Gary Nash, and from the point of view of professional historians, there was really nothing controversial about it. And then, of course, there are also museums. Museums did not escape the culture wars of the 1980s and the 1990s. An issue here typically was the balance between memorialization and education. In 1991, for example, the National Museum of American Art put on an exhibition entitled The West as America, featuring, the famous Bierstadt and other Western artists in their exhibition, and they accompanied those paintings with commentary that reflected some of the findings of the new Western history. And oh my goodness, the harsh criticism that ensued. The new Western history moves away from the old frontier idea and talks more about the interaction of cultures in the West, and even, as Patty Limerick rephrased it, the legacy of conquest, the way in which whites basically conquered other peoples in the West. Even more heated, and some more of you probably will remember this, even more heated was the controversy in 1994 when the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum attempted to mount an exhibit commemorating the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And again, they wrote a script and created placards for the walls, including some historical context representing the more recent historical understandings of that event. That produced a storm of protest that went on for months, pitting various opposing groups against professional historians, including the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association, two principal organizations in this country. It culminated finally in a decision to do nothing more than to exhibit a portion of the fuselage of the Enola Gay. There are also what I call historical silences, and I'm getting kind of close to the end. For a very long time, race, minorities, women, gays, class divisions, and so on were left out of the historical narrative. They're no longer left out of the narratives produced by professional historians, although there continues to be pushback, as I said, with regard to the textbooks and so on. Related to this is the absence of context. And this is something that's kind of peeved me for a number of years. Every October, we are reminded of how close we came, how close the whole world came, to the nuclear holocaust in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And rightly reminded. It was a terrifying time. I remember it very, very well. But how often do commentators, editorial writers, talking heads, talk about the context? What was that context? American efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro 8 times by 1965. U.S. support for saboteurs and terrorists operating in Cuba out of Miami. U.S. preparations for an invasion, Operation Mongoose, which was run by a general who had been involved in Vietnam as well, but overseen by Robert Kennedy. In fact, years later, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense himself, said, if I had been Castro prior to that, I would have assumed and feared that, in fact, the Americans were going to invade. And certainly many in the United States military leadership wanted to do precisely that. Context. We've been at odds with Iran now for almost 40 years, since the takeover of the American embassy in 1979. Again, context. And they know the context. But rarely do you hear Americans talk about the context. What about our overthrow of a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953, principally for the purpose of protecting British oil interests? BP has its origins, by the way, in this particular incident. I'll talk more about that later if you want. Another category, statements of presidents and other political leaders. We've seen kerfuffle recently about some of the statements of the current president, President Trump, who seemingly thought that if only Andrew Jackson had been president in 1861, he certainly could have avoided the Civil War, not apparently knowing that he'd been dead for 16 years. And the one that's really truly astonishing to me is an astonishing statement that nobody thinks about the causes of the Civil War. Well, guess what? We've been thinking about it for over 150 years. Everybody's been thinking about it. Maybe President Trump hasn't. Okay, fine. But we have. Another example I would use. I'm going to throw in a Democrat here for a minute. In the 1960 presidential election, soon-to-be President John F. Kennedy made a big deal about the so-called missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s and criticized the Eisenhower administration. The big campaign thing. It wasn't true. Well, that's not quite true. It was true that there was a missile gap, it's just that it was in our favor. And Kennedy knew that. Eisenhower knew it. Nixon knew it. But Eisenhower and Nixon couldn't really respond effectively because to do so would have been publicly revealed that we were flying U-2 flights secretly over Russia when we were every one of their, I don't think it was more than a half dozen or so intercontinental missiles at the time. Okay? That sort of eases over fake news, fake history, I suppose. Or one of my favorite that I used to use in my Vietnam War class. President Ronald Reagan gave a speech in 1982 about Vietnam. Almost every sentence of which is just flat wrong. Now, I've got a copy of it, we can talk about it later if you want, but as far as history goes, it is just flat wrong. Now, I don't know whether he wrote it or somebody wrote it for him, it's just flat wrong. And I can demonstrate. Then, more recently in 2009, the then governor of Texas, Rick Perry, said before a crowd in front of the Capitol steps in Austin, and I quote, "Texas is a unique place. When we came in the Union in 1845, one of the issues that we would be able to leave if we decided to do that." Not true. There is no such document. Any historian will tell you there is no such document. If that were true, why didn't we let them secede in 1861? And if that were true, why didn't we force them to do certain things when we finally let them back in 1870? There's no such document, not in the annexation of Texas or any other document related to it. Misleading statements about the history in the Persian Gulf leading up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And my point here is not that every president must be a professional historian, but that their understanding of history or lack thereof, Democrat or Republican, profoundly affects policy. Profoundly affects policy. Now, I could provide many more examples, and we might in the question and answer session. But the point really I want to make here in conclusion is simply this. Quite apart from what we might call outright fake history, of the kind, that Joseph Goebbels might produce, or the Soviet Union might produce, or the Japanese conservatives might produce, apart from that, history is often bitterly contested in our culture. And it's contested often, most often, from opposing political perspectives. That makes it incredibly important to try to get it right. Just as professional journalists struggle to combat the phenomenon of fake news, so too historians and the professional organizations that represent them struggle to counter the propagation and dissemination of fake history. We've probably all heard the expression attributed to the philosopher George Santana. Quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Anybody here not ever heard that? Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Perhaps you have heard part of Henry Ford's comment. Henry Ford is attributed, or this particular comment is attributed to Henry Ford. "History is more or less bunk." He goes on in that same quote, which you rarely hear. "History is more or less bunk. It's tradition. We don't want tradition. We want to live in the present. And the only history that is worth a tinker's damn is the history that we make today." That was quoted in the Chicago Tribune in 1916. I prefer William Faulkner's take on the issue. In his novel, The Intruder in the Dust, Faulkner has a character say, the past is not dead, it's not even past. Only a Southerner, I think, would say that maybe. Even more importantly, especially today, I think, is George Orwell's take on the issue in his dystopian novel, 1984, and I quote, and I'll leave with this quote: "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Thank you. Well, I can also walk up and down, but you know what?
Before we start the question and answer, since I knew we were going to start losing people, and I wanted to make sure a couple of points are made. Number one, you know what the basic trouble that we have right now is the absence of truth. I mean, I'm working on a future program for fake science. We've dealt with fake news, we're dealing with fake history, and I'm going to deal with one on fake economics. If I hear anybody again tell me that trickle-down economics works. But, so this is extremely important, and I think the fact that I have a few extra copies of what John Welle came up with is where you can find straight news and factual news. And there's a few up here that I'll leave on the chair here. Once more, before I go wandering around with the mic, I think it's only fair to acknowledge a new person here who's probably working harder than any of us right now. Kathy Allen, do you mind saying hi to the Freethinkers? Kathy and her husband are here, and thank you for joining us, and boy, I hope you're my representative. Okay, here I go with the mic.
If this works?
Yes. Lynette?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, working now.
I think we could add major religious movements also into the fake news.
I think that's a fair statement, and I didn't want to go there because I'm more interested in the politics.
Why not? It's, I mean, Christianity, you could take it as a major, yeah, you could go that way.
Well, I should say, you know, I mentioned David Barton at the very beginning. He and Glenn Beck, you know, doing the seminar. David Barton is a person who is highly regarded in the evangelical Christian right, and that's where his base of support is. And so he's said some pretty extraordinary things. And I, you know, as I first saw the article that I mentioned to you, I said, okay, I need to double check some of this stuff. And so I did the usual thing on Google, and you got to be really careful because there's all kinds of stuff on the internet. But among other things, the one thing that I did find that I took to be truthful was Glenn Beck's blog, or actually his website, a website called Mercury 1, named after the first U.S. space ship, in which, among other things, they detail on that website the basic topics that they're going to discuss in this seminar on real history, as opposed to what those terrible history professors are teaching. So I assumed it was true.
Mike?
Yeah, what do you think about, and I've got sort of a mix of feelings about this, the latest thing in the South where they're taking down statues of Confederate generals or whatever. I mean, that was history. Is it whitewashing, or is it the right thing to do, or?
Well, I suspected I would get a question about that. Of course, let me preface my remarks about that by saying that my ancestors on both sides of the family, some of my ancestors on both sides of my family, fought in the Civil War with the Confederacy. Okay, my great-grandfather on my mother's side was a Louisiana partisan ranger in 1864, helping to fight Nathaniel Banks' invasion up the Red River. And I grew up, by the way, in a totally segregated East Texas society. Went to 12 years in a totally segregated school.
I don't have any problem with what is going on these days in terms of the questioning how much we should honor people who, and this may, you may, wince at this, but people who, according to the Constitution of the United States, which they claim to revere, committed treason. The definition of treason is spelled out in the Constitution, making war against the government of the United States. Now, I realize that people go crazy when you say things like that, and it's hard for me, all of my forebears, I'm from the South, everybody's from the South. And the problem is that so much of this is tied up with the whole question of slavery and race. They're just our ancestors, Robert E. Lee, was a really honorable man. That's the classic image. Well, he's an honorable man who never gave up his slaves until he had to. And he was an honorable man who led an army through 4 years of war, in which when they came across runaway slaves, they re-enslaved them, and so on. I think, and I have a copy of it here somewhere, I think that one of the best statements I've seen on all of that, and I can find it and quote from it if you want, was a statement recently. Recently there was a controversy in New Orleans because Mitch Landrieu, is that his name? I think the mayor, and the city council decided to take down some of the Confederate war hero monuments, and it was very controversial. I probably should try to find that, because I thought it was one of the best statements I've ever seen by a contemporary politicians in the South. And if I can find it real quick. That microphone is driving me crazy. Here we go. He made a remarkable speech, I thought, and this is actually quoted in an article. It's actually in the Salt Lake Tribune, July 4th, as a matter of fact, and the article is a column by E.J. Dunn. Here's what Landrieu said in New Orleans in response to this. The historic record is clear. The Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and P.G.T. Beauregard statues were not erected just to honor these men, but as part of the movement which became known as the cult of the lost cause, which I mentioned. This cult has one goal: through monuments and through other means, to rewrite history, to hide the truth, which is that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of humanity. It's self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States of America, they fought against it. These monuments purposefully celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, and the terror that is actually stood for, end quote. And then he went on to recall the main cause of the Southern Rebellion. He cited, and I'm glad he did, I actually have a copy of the speech myself, prior to secession, or at least prior to the secession in most of the South, future Vice President Alexander Stephens gave a famous speech. It's called the Cornerstone Speech. And in it, and this is a brief quotation, the cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, the Confederate government, is the first government in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So I applaud. It's controversial, I understand. As I said, I grew up reading Robert E. Lee, and it's a tough thing. But at some point, we have to, if you were a black child going to Robert E. Lee's elementary school, what does that say to you? What does that say to you? In many black neighborhoods and cities in the South, all the streets are named after Civil War heroes, Confederate Civil War heroes. Anyway, other people may have other opinions.
I'm wondering if you have, what your opinion is of some of the Ken Burns series. He's done several that seem to, what intrigues me about them is that he seems to go back to the original source material. Right. What is your opinion of those?
Well, like so many people, I certainly think he has proven to be a profoundly brilliant filmmaker. I think the Civil War series was extraordinary in terms of its cinematic skills and so forth. In fact, right up until last year, I was still using a few of I didn't use them all, of course, in my class, but I recognized immediately that a 50-minute film that he did on Gettysburg got more across to my students than I could do in 50 minutes about a 3-day battle, right? And some Civil War historians had some issues, okay? There is a tendency to, there's still kind of a tendency to romanticize. And part of the whole myth of the lost cause cult is the idea that, well, both sides were honorable, both sides, you know, had a case to make, and both sides behaved honorably, and it was a tragedy. Well, it was a tragedy. We now know, for example, that 750,000, probably 750,000 Americans died in 4 years. That's about 2.5% of the population. What would that be today? What are we about? Over 3 million? So, an awful lot of people. So, there's a tendency of sort of moral equivalence. And a lot of historians today say that, you know, this is just wrong. There's not a moral equivalence. They were fighting, and I've got lots of quotations here I can share with you. They were fighting to preserve slavery, human slavery. 4 million blacks were enslaved at that moment in time, 1860, 61. So 750,000 died, 4 million were freed. 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. Another 20,000 served in the Union Navy. And for 100 years, they sort of got written out of the story. I have a little piece I always did in my class about, there was a reunion, a 50-year reunion in 1915 at Gettysburg. So you see these wonderful pictures of, you know, old Confederate and Union soldiers, you know, shaking hands and hugging each other. And President Wilson came to the affair and gave a speech and so forth. There were no black people there. Not quite true. There were black people there cleaning the toilets and serving the food. And by the way, you know, Wilson, Glenn Beck and the guys are pretty much right on this one. I mean, Wilson was a racist. He was a great president in many ways, but he was a racist. He segregated the federal government. Great progress had been made prior to his becoming president in 1913. He segregated.
George?
Yeah, I have a question. You teach in university. How did the young generation today, you teach all this, what you just told us today here
Right.
at the university, how does the young generation react to all that? Do they know all this?
You know, it's a really good question. I don't think they react badly to it. I think what I found is, and I try to hit some of these things really hard, but I find they're very open to it. I mean, there are some from the South who have been taught other things, okay? And there are some, and I'm not sure where they get it, but I fairly regularly had students come up to me and ask me, not about the war necessarily, but about, is it true that the Constitution was founded on the Bible? Well, I have to assume they've been exposed to Glenn Beck, or, you know, Glenn Beck got most of his stuff originally from Cleo Skousen, the Utah conservative, who wrote a book called 5,000 Year Leap or something, and makes these same points. I find the younger generation pretty darn open to most of this stuff. Not universally, certainly, but I never got a whole lot of pushback on that sort of thing. And I think maybe 40 years ago when I first started, I might have gotten more. It's sort of like, you know, the issue of gay rights and so forth. The younger generation is pretty much on board.
Ray, like this.
I'm sorry, yeah. I always forget. Thank you. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I never found a whole lot of pushback from my students.
In Ohio, there's a different story, and in this room, I don't see no one black person.
Right.
In Ohio, it's completely different than what you were talking about, the Penn School's talking, and there was mixed blacks and non-blacks.
Well, yeah, although I taught at the University of Utah, okay, so there weren't a lot of African Americans.
So there's different
But I always
over
had
there
some.
than over here.
Yeah.
The war was mostly in the east than in the west.
Well, actually, that's true to a certain extent, but it raises another whole issue, and that is that present-day historians, some present-day historians, and they make a powerful argument, argue that too much attention has been attached to the war in the East, particularly Virginia, because, well, a number of things, of course, because a lot of that fighting took place between Washington and Richmond, so it's a very narrow field of battle, if you will. Plus, that's where Robert E. Lee was, and ultimately that's where Grant was. But some historians are saying, strategically and so forth, the West may well have been far more important. And after all, Ulysses S. Grant made his original name in the West. Huge string of victories in 1862, particularly. At Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and capturing Nashville, and ultimately the Union Army capturing New Orleans in April of 1862, and so on. So there are some historians now who say, in a way, the disproportionate focus on the Virginia theater is in some ways a distortion, of the bigger picture.
Dr. Welle?
I just came back from New Mexico,
Oh,
and
one
our guide
minute.
told us.
Here, I could.
One more back here.
Yeah, just coming back from New Mexico, our guide told us that the Confederates were actually in New Mexico because they wanted to head to the Pacific and have control. And so how do you tell the difference between a Yankee cemetery and a Confederate cemetery in New Mexico? The Confederates have a triangle on top, so the Yankees can't sit on them.
I read that as well, and not just in New Mexico, but other places as well. There were no major battles in New Mexico. There were no major battles in Texas, although Texas was very, very important, right, obviously. Partly because an awful lot of the cotton had to go through Texas and through Brownsville in Mexico to get out after the Union took New Orleans and blockaded all the southern ports on the Gulf and East Coast and so on. But the other thing that has always bothered me is the way in which Americans have tended to romanticize that war. I mean, we all probably have seen Gone with the Wind and so forth. It was a terrible. I have a book I brought with me called "What was this cruel war for?" Well, it was a cruel war. We used to say 620,000 dead, another 50,000 probably civilians, maybe dead. Very recent research using demographic techniques has upped that to 750,000. 750,000 dead in 4 years. I used to say that's almost, the 620,000, almost more than the sum total of all American other wars combined. Now that they've upped it to 750, I think it probably is more than every war since the first Indian battle up through Iraq and Afghanistan. It's more in 4 years. And it lasted, it lasted a little bit longer than our participation in World War II. And it was a cruel war. And if you go to Missouri, for example, Missouri did not secede from the Union. But there was a vicious civil war, internal civil war, both sides committing atrocities, raping and killing and taking scalps. This is the area where Bloody Bill Anderson and William Quantrell, and people like that, Jesse James. I mean, Jesse James, we all probably saw movies growing up about, Jesse James or Robin Hood of the West or whatever, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. That's another historical myth nonsense. What Jesse James was doing after the war was continuing the war. And we romanticize these people. I mentioned the Fort Pillow thing. I mean, it's an extraordinary case. I mean, literally, I have quotes here of Confederate soldiers writing home and telling their families, my God, it was awful. These black troops would run up to us and get on their knees and pray to us to allow them to survive. And the Confederate troops would just shoot them down. One report said they even crucified some of them. They crucified them on tent stakes and then set the tents on fire. Now, the extraordinary thing about that, another extraordinary thing about it, is the fact that it wasn't as rare a thing as you might think, because it was Confederate government policy not to take black troops alive in Union uniforms. At best, they would be re-enslaved, and often they'd simply be shot. Throughout most of the early part of the war, first couple of years of the war, Union and Confederate generals, had an agreement. After a terrible battle, they would call a truce, and people would be allowed to exchange, pick up their dead and wounded and so forth. And also there was a policy that they would exchange prisoners. But the Confederates said, okay, fine, but we're not giving you back any Union African-American troops. Whereupon General Grant said, fine, we're not exchanging any prisoners if you don't give us those folks back. And wherever Lee's army marched, into Maryland or Pennsylvania, wherever it was, they simply re-enslaved or enslaved for the first time in some cases any African-Americans they found. So another book I have here is a wonderful little book by a historian named Charles Dew, a good Southern boy who had written several other books, taught up in New England somewhere, I forget where, but he discovered that in late 1860 and early 1861, after the first 7 southern states had seceded, the southern state secession conventions appointed commissioners to be sent to other southern states to try to convince them, to also secede. And Dew, there's a passage in there that is in some ways heart-wrenching that I could identify with. He said, I was stunned. He said, I grew up with all of the myths of the Old South and the cult of the, just cause and so forth. And he said, I was utterly stunned, as he'd already been a professional historian, that they made the case invariably for secession on the basis of not just preserving slavery, but on the basis of white racial superiority. So here's another Southern boy who learned something as a result of real historical research.
Okay.
Yep.
So my family is also from Eastern Texas.
Oh, really?
And a few years ago, I decided to delve into my genealogy, and I learned that I was descended from the Lee family.
From which family?
The Lee family.
Oh, Lee. Okay.
I like to say that I'm descended from Richard Henry Lee, but I have a crazy sister, and she goes out and reenacts the Civil War on the Confederate side.
Right.
So I'm just going to save the opposition research, so I'm going to just tell you right now that my sister's crazy. But I had told her that Robert E. Lee was our distant relative, and so she got even more enthusiastic about working for the Confederacy. So here's my comment and question. I wonder what really attracts people to reenact the Civil War, and I imagine that it's part of this whole mythology that you're talking about, but further than that, it seems to me that this fake history is the symbolic father of fake news. And more importantly, what do you do about it? What do you do to stop it? Because it's permeating our society, and it's causing us to not be able to base solutions on actual truth and actual facts, which can only lead us astray.
Okay, a couple of thoughts. I obviously don't know which Lee you were related to in the end. I'll give you a personal example, though, of how this sometimes plays out. All my life, as a kid growing up, I was told by older members of the family that my great uncle was with Stonewall Jackson when he was killed by his own men accidentally, as it happened, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, or right after the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863. And of course, that was something that was always repeated at reunions proudly and so on. Well, I've done some of my genealogy too. And it is certainly true that my great uncle was with Stonewall Jackson's army at Chancellorsville. But I found the records. He was a mule skinner. So I'm pretty sure he wasn't hanging out with General Jackson. You know? So I did bring that up one time at a reunion. They never asked me to speak again. But it's very clear. And I've got his enlistment papers and his discharge papers from the National Archives. So that's the kind of thing that gets perpetuated, as we know, in the South. Okay, and I grew up with the totally wrong. Reconstruction was a great tragedy imposed by the poor, helpless Southerners, by those nasty old radical pro-Negro Republicans who, came down there in 1865 and so on. Well, real historians don't accept that version, for sure. What can we do about it? Well, as has been pointed out, you've got to work at finding out, what the reliable sources of news are. I read the Tribune. I start with the Tribune every morning. I read the New York Times. I also go on, because it's free, the Guardian on the internet, which is a slightly left-wing, British newspaper. But I find stuff that's not being reported here. And then I look at several other sources of different political persuasions on the internet as well. You have to work at that. As far as the fake history, this is, in some ways, being a historian, a much more troublesome issue for me, because clearly history as a discipline is not in great favor in this country today. We had before I retired a lot of issues having to do, and a lot of discussions having to do with the fact that not only were the numbers of students in our classes declining, but the number of history majors was declining. And about that time, we were getting a new dean, so I decided to do a little investigation, and I went on the internet and found reliable sources that pointed out that at Yale, for example, where for many, many years, decades, history was the biggest major on campus at Yale University. That's declined by about a third. They dropped down to number 3 now, after economics and political science. Our new dean was from the University of Illinois, and I found out that over the last decade, the University of Illinois History Department, which has always been one of the finest, history majors had dropped by a third.
Wow.
So this is a national issue, okay? And I've been appalled at the fact that at the University of Utah, you can get a 4-year degree without ever taking a single history course in any subject. I think that's outrageous. I had to take 2 years of U.S. history plus 1 semester of Texas history, and I think 1 semester of Texas government.
Yeah, but it was all wrong.
No, it wasn't. Well, you can, people. There are a lot of reasons for this. I mean, obviously, one reason is people have been gravitating to, finance and, business programs and this sort of thing, obviously, and some of it is just simply beyond our control. But the problem is, as I said before, more people get their history from popular culture today than they do from school or university classes or real history books. And I don't entirely know what to do about it.
Kirk, then Ted, and okay.
I'd like to make an analogy. I've been to a lot of family and friends' funerals.
I didn't do it.
Oh, okay. So anyway, I've been to people's funerals, family members, people I know quite well, and you're sitting there listening to the eulogy thinking, is this the same person I knew? And I wonder, do you think it's human nature? People just a lot of times forget about bad things and just try to say the nice things. Us non-historians, we just don't want to step on anybody's toes.
Well, I mean, obviously, this probably plays some part of a role in it all. But I do think, I go back to what I said in the presentation, which is there was a conscious effort by Confederate and Southern apologists after the Civil War to shape the memory of that war. There's a wonderful book by a historian by the name of David Blight called Race in the Union, and he lays all this out. Probably would surprise you to learn, for example, that the first predecessor in what we now regard as Memorial Day was not what we used to think. It was actually done by African Americans on the racetrack in Charleston, South Carolina in the summer of 1865, written out of history. Furthermore, I think part of the problem in terms of that is that, as he points out, in the few decades after the American Civil War, you had the troubles of the Reconstruction era and so on. You had the regaining of power by the Southern Democrats in the South by the mid-1870s. The war was waning and so forth. Southerners began to institute segregation. And by the way, legal segregation came about after the Civil War. It came about legally from about the mid-1870s into the 1890s. It was not something that predated or existed before. So it's very conscious in that regard. And his argument, David Black's argument, is that Northerners basically accepted reconciliation with the South by the late 19th century, but the price they paid was to write out the African American experience of the story. Right? I mean, it's just remarkable the extent to which we did that. And remember, free blacks made enormous progress in the late 1860s and into the early 1870s, and continued on to vote and all the rest until about the 1890s, in which southern states specifically and consciously disenfranchised them. And remember, the war ended in 1865. The first serious civil rights act in this country was 1964. 1965, you get the Voting Rights Act. For 100 years after that terrible war, which was without question fought over slavery. I know a lot of people don't necessarily buy that, but it's true. For 100 years after that, emancipation basically was written out of the story and what that meant and the accomplishments of African Americans. And they continued to struggle, of course. They never stopped struggling, but for 100 years. And for 100 years, as I was taught in the 1950s, basically the story of the Civil War. We always joked in the South, it wasn't the Civil War. It was either the war between the states, which, by the way, was a term never used in the 1860s, or, as jokesters would say, Southerners would call it the late unpleasantness. My grandfather, who certainly was not alive, but it was his father, who I mentioned before, who had served in Louisiana. I grew up, and he was pretty old by the time I knew what was going on in life. But for him, the word "damn Yankee" was one word. that was the attitude.
This is Ted.
Going.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
This is sort of a personal history story. When I was growing up, I was one of those kids that always questioned things. I'm sure I was a pain. Anyway, my surname is Ottinger. So I said, where did Ottinger come from? Where's his name? And they said, Pennsylvania Dutch. Well, I was a fairly smart kid, and I realized we all had to come from somewhere else unless we were Native Americans. And so I continued to be fascinated, and finally I got older and went to one of those big books in the library and found out the name Ottinger is from the town of Ottingen in Germany. Many years ago, when my son was a teenager, we took a trip to Europe and took a side trip to Ottingen. And we were treated like celebrities because there's no longer any Ottingers in Ottingen. I didn't know why at the time. I thought, well, little town people grow up and move, get jobs. And then some years ago, I'm teaching in Los Angeles, and there was a field trip to the Holocaust Museum. I didn't go, my assistant went, and she brought back 2 of the brochures of 2 children that were brother and sister that were killed in the Holocaust with my last name. And so then I go on from there. Just a few years ago, I Googled my last name, Holocaust, and found out 1,101 people with the name Ottinger were killed in the Holocaust. And then it makes sense why there were no longer any Ottingers in Ottingen, but I thought it was interesting that no one there mentioned that. They shared that for what it's worth.
Well, yeah, and that's, you know, like our Civil War, of course, in World War II, and who was complicit for what, you know, remains hotly contested, not just in France, where I mentioned France, but certainly in Poland. You know, it's been a really hot issue in Poland, and some other, in Ukraine and some other countries as well, because some of the folks in these countries certainly were complicit in either, you know, I mean, some saved Jews, but many more, in some form or another, collaborated with the Germans or looked the other way, and you know, sometimes they don't want to admit that. Certainly the Poles criticized, I think the Poles criticized President Obama once for referring to, I can't remember what he said. He referred, in one speech he referred to a death camp in Polish death camp, and they said, no, it wasn't a Polish death camp, it was a German death camp in Poland.
That's true.
Yeah, no, that's true, but it's also true that some Poles, we know, there's a wonderful book about one town in particular. It was the Poles, not the Germans, who committed the atrocity. But, you know, to this day, the French, you know, are deeply divided over resistance versus collaboration, and, you know, and all the rest of it. I'm sorry, we're going to get to this gentleman.
Right, we got, I'm going to give this microphone to this gentleman, and then following that, I know some of you are starting to get that 90-minute restlessness. So as long as Ray can stay here and talk with you informally, we'll do that. But as far as me walking around with this mic, I'll stop. If you haven't signed up, anyone here who's not on our roster, please stop by me before you leave, and I'll let you sign up. There you go.
Thank you. You know, we're talking about fake history. What about the history, the elimination history? You know, my people aren't even mentioned, and if they are, you know, it's not very, it's not very respectful. And, you know, there's been a Holocaust with our people. I mean, we've lost, you know, you talked about the Jews, you know, maybe 4 or 5 million, plus the others. Ours has been millions and millions, you know, and there's not a word mentioned. It goes on today. You know, there's stuff going on.
Oh, I don't at all dispute what you're saying. The only thing I would say as a positive note is that it is not true that that story is not told within colleges and universities. It certainly is. I mean, some of my most famous and best colleagues are specialists in Native American history or Indian history, however you prefer to refer to it. We have courses. Interesting though, for many, many years, my department taught a course, I think it was called, I remember correctly, Native American history, the two-semester survey of Native American history, okay? And taught my various faculty over the years. And it used to get, when I was department chair, it would get 50, 60, 70 students. In the last 15 years, probably lucky to get 10. Now, I don't know, we had good teachers. I don't know why that's true. Same thing was true, though, by the way, with African American history. Used to get, 30, 40 students every semester. In recent years, we've gotten very few. Same is true with Chicano history. I don't know why that's true. So you are right, but I will say that professional historians have not ignored that story. The issue is, how does it get down to the public? How does it get down to the high school?
Yeah, because a lot of people don't go to college.
I know.
So, yeah.
And there's never been, maybe, what's his name who did the Civil War thing should do a thing on Native Americans. Ken Burns, yeah.
You know, there's several Native Americans that don't like to be called Native American.
Right.
There were like 500 nations here.
Yeah, I know.
And like myself, I'm an Apache.
Yeah.
Okay, and
I used to have a Hickory Apache colleague.
okay,
Yeah.
we're Chiricahua. But anyway, there's one thing in history I'd like to correct. That Columbus didn't discover America.
Totally agree.
No,
Totally agree.
we found him lost at sea.
Well, I mean, just to make your point, I think as everybody, most people probably know, I mean, estimates are that at the time Columbus made his trip to the north, there were probably something in the neighborhood of 5 million or so native peoples above the Rio Grande. And in the Western Hemisphere, the numbers could have been as high as 80 million. 80 million. And of course, you had the great demographic disasters and disease and war and so forth in some places, particularly in some of the islands. With just in a very few short years, 90% of the population was gone. 90% gone. No, I understand.
Well, in Mexico, when Cortez was there, they figured there was 500,000 people, right?
In the city,
Mexico.
yeah, absolutely. And of course, we're still finding, we know about, the Aztec cities, and we know about Machu Picchu and so on, but we're still finding in the jungles of South America and Central America remnants of communities we're only now finding out about. And of course, part of the story is, one of the things that the Spanish did is they destroyed all the records that they could find of the native peoples when they went in there. And so some things have survived. A former university professor was very famous, and I forget what it was called, something cognitive, which had to do with the Aztec or Mayan language. I can't remember. I have a very close friend, by the way, whose specialty is Nahuatl language, which is one of those essentially dead languages. But as Don said, I have nowhere to be. I ate enough breakfast that I could hold out a lot later. So I'm game to talk about what you want to talk
So I got a question on Lech Walesa and Ronald Reagan. Which one bears more towards tearing down the Russian Empire? Which one gets more credit?
Well, I mean, I can only give you a personal opinion. It's not especially. I mean, I would argue that I hesitate to say one or the other. Okay, what I would say though is that the Soviet Union was in far worse shape for a far longer period of time than the American people were told. I mean, I was reading articles, back in the late 60s, early 70s, talking about how it was, basically a shell, corrupt. The military wasn't nearly as awesome as the Pentagon and the CIA liked us to believe, so they could keep the money flowing. Okay, there's no question that by the time you get to the 1980s, our continuing build-up, Reagan's, decision to massively, increase military spending contributed to the difficulties of the Soviet Union that already existed because they simply weren't able to keep up with it. Okay, I think they weren't able to keep up with it, and if that was indeed his primary reason for doing it, that's an important thing, and part of it probably was true. Of course, the other thing is there's an awful lot of research that shows that part of the reason he wanted to increase spending was to so hamper and undermine the federal budget that they'd have to cut social programs, domestic social programs here in this country. So the two things were going on at the same time. Star Wars, almost very few scientists ever for a second thought Star Wars would work. Okay, this was another brainchild of Edward Teller, who of course was the father of the hydrogen bomb. Most physicists said, you're never going to be able to find a way to stop all the incoming missiles that might be coming in, because all you have to do is put more and more fakes, So it contributed, but I also think the, maybe the sclerotic nature of the leadership of the Soviet Union by that time. Remember, Gorbachev died, and you had these two guys who, one was the former KGB guy, and I can't remember. One was named and drop off, and the other guy was named, and he did drop off, by the way, pretty quickly. I forget the other, Chernoff or something. Anyway, in the 80s, before a younger Gorbachev came along, it was pretty clear that the leadership was in dire, dire trouble. And so individuals do have an enormous impact. Okay, a perfectly good example of this, by the way, is Deng Xiaoping. It was Deng Xiaoping who had been a target of the Red Guard back in the 1960s, who made his way back into power. And it's Deng Xiaoping who could be ruthless, but it was he that moved China to a market-oriented economy with the results that we see today. Okay, Gorbachev, I think, probably deserves more credit than he gets. Okay, I really do think that. He saw that the system was not sustainable and began to try to make some changes. He would have been a lot slower probably if he had stayed in power. So I mean, that's not a very good answer. It's a hard question. Supporters of Reagan will say it was all, Reagan's brilliant policies. But other scholars say, well, you can't ignore, and there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on. I mean, I was surprised to learn, for example, that when the Berlin Wall, they started tearing down the Berlin Wall, in 1989, Margaret Thatcher called up Gorbachev and told him to send the military in.
What?
Well, because she thought it was going to create such chaos that it would be utterly destabilizing. I mean, this is the great, anti-communist. Happily, they didn't do that, and happily, he didn't send the army in the way his predecessors did in Hungary in 1966, and in East Germany in 1953, and Czechoslovakia in 1968, and so on. So I give Gorbachev an awful lot of credit. I mean, if Brezhnev had still been in power, a little bit younger than Brezhnev was, and healthier, might have happened differently. After all, don't forget, it was Brezhnev that sent the Russian army to his great regret into Afghanistan in 1979. Although Zbigniew Brzezinski boasted a year or two ago in an interview that we had enticed them in. We wanted them to have their Vietnam. That's the best answer I can give you.
For the few that are left here, let's give Ray a round of applause. This has been wonderful.
So why the fascination with the battle flag instead of the actual Confederate nation flag?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a whole history of the flag, the history of that flag, and it is the battle flag rather than the flag.
And it was actually just Lee's battle flag, was it not?
I believe it was just the Army of the Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly. I mean, it's a cool flag. Another interesting thing about that, by the way, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if I'm not mistaken, there are 13 stars on it, on the cross.
Yes.
Okay. There were 13 Confederate states.
But they used 13 for some reason.
Well, I'll tell you why. A couple of years ago, I was down in Texas doing some research in the Texas State Archives, and I've been there before, but I was having some documents copied, and so I had to kill some time doing that in the archives. So I wandered over to the state capitol, and as I said, I've been there before, but the United Daughters of the Confederacy, I think it was in 1902, had put up a monument, Confederate monument, on the Capitol, Texas State Capitol grounds. I had seen it before, but I hadn't really paid much attention to it. Well, these days historians really look closely and deconstruct monuments because they're fascinating. I have a whole presentation just on historical monuments. So I'm looking at it and I'm walking around, and it was clear that the other soldier on top, but near the top, it was kind of square. And what they had done was they had put the names of each of the states that had seceded from the Union on each of those squares, right, as you walked around it, in the order in which they seceded. So obviously it started in South Carolina. And so I walked around it, and I looked at it and I said, man, there's something wrong. There are 13 states. Only 11 states seceded. Quickly, I realized exactly what it was. And it may be the reason for the 2 extra stars on the flag, I'm not sure. They included Missouri and Kentucky, which were deeply divided but did not secede from the Union. So, you know, when you look at all, I have a whole presentation on Confederate monuments, because, not just Confederate monuments, Civil War monuments, because it's just amazing. You know, you go to some of these places and you think you can rely on the historical accuracy of what you're looking at, and it ain't always so, you know? I mean, even, you know, each of the states has a monument at, you know, at Gettysburg, let's say, and the South Carolina monument is all about the ideology of states' rights and blah, blah, blah. And you can find similar kinds of things. There are Confederate monuments which actually depict blacks marching with Southern troops. And that whole business is still very controversial about whether or not black volunteers. Well, thousands of slaves were brought along, you know, by the Confederate Army. Most of the officers had a manservant, for example, and they used slaves. One of the reasons Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, because they were using slaves to build fortifications and so on. So that was the same as having that many extra soldiers, in effect. So did any slave ever pick up a rifle in the heat of a battle and fire it at the, you know, Yankees? Probably did, you know. But the idea that many hundreds, much less many thousands, voluntarily served in the get my wars mixed up, in the Confederate Army is just not true. Now, in early 1865, by which time things were going very badly, the Confederate Congress did have Confederate Congress did have a huge debate about a proposal to allow slaves to enlist in the Confederate Army, in return for which they could get their freedom. And Robert E. Lee originally opposed it, but things were so bad by February of 1865 that he kind of relented. And they did pass that. Remember, the war was over in April. Okay, so February to April. I think there was a kind of a battalion of older, you know, whites and blacks that may have been formed in Richmond at the very end of the war. But there's a Georgia congressman by the name of Cobb, either congressman or senator, and he totally opposed it. I wish I had his quote exactly, but basically to paraphrase it, he said, you know, we cannot do this, because if we do this, and if we acknowledge the black slave capable of being courageous and brave and effective soldiers, it will be the denial of everything our whole society is founded on. Yeah. And then, you know, your point, I mean, you're right. Okay, all I can tell you is that in colleges and university history courses and in textbooks, that story is not ignored. Okay, it was for a long time, you know. But I have one of the finest Native American scholars in the country. Used to be at the University of Utah, my colleague, Richard White. He's at Stanford now. He got one of the MacArthur Genius Grants a few years ago. And we have an American West Center at the University of Utah, which most of what they do is work with local tribes. His replacement is actually one of his students who works very closely with the Shoshone, for example. Previous director of that senator of that Senate was, I'm having a senior moment. Worked very closely with all the different Indian groups in Utah and the rest of the stuff. So you're right that it often gets left out of, and things that happen are terrible, and still, I mean, issues still exist over who controls the land, and, you know, like Bears Ear, for example, and so on. And controversies over whether or not, you know, sports teams, you know, Washington Redskins, Cleveland Indians, the Utes. Now, they work with the Ute tribe apparently on that one, but it looks like the Washington Redskins are going to be allowed to basically not change because of the recent Supreme Court decision. In another case, having to do with an Asian American rock band called the Slant Eyes.
The slants.
The slants, is this the slants? Yeah, the slants, but referring to the stereotype of slant eyes. And people objected to that, and they themselves went to court and said, well, we want to be called the slants, to make a point, and the Supreme Court apparently said, yeah. So these battles are continually going on. I mean, that's why you can't just say, well, history is an interesting story from way back when. It's part of our everyday life. I mean, in so many ways. It's just part of our everyday life.
Can you comment on the role of archaeology in history? We didn't touch on that.
Well, no, I didn't, but I'm certainly not an archaeologist, but it's obviously a very, very important, part of uncovering the past.
Right.
And my department actually has an archaeologist on its staff. I mean, I won't go into how that happened. It doesn't normally happen. It was a partner kind of a situation. But usually they're separate departments, so they're in anthropology or whatever.
But it really does play into.
Well, it plays a huge role. And of course,
yes.
one of the differences is they work with artifacts. I mean, they work with mostly, not always, but mostly with nonverbal kinds of evidence, but it's still evidence. And
Yes.
so we're finding stuff
And that's
every
the
day.
only way that, farther back, that we can give ourselves a history, and that's with every section of the country.
Yeah. Oh, well, and
I
every,
mean, the world, excuse me.
even now, it doesn't even have to go that far back. I mean, archaeologists in recent years, first they've been excavating for some time now, Jamestown, Virginia, for example. Furthermore, they found African American cemeteries
Yeah.
in New York City, for example, and they have, in recent years, excavated Mount Vernon and Jefferson's home at Monticello and revealed for the first time a fuller picture of slave quarters.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be, and I don't think it's true anymore, but it used to be that, you go to Mount Vernon, Washington had servants, he didn't have slaves, which is ridiculous. Now, to Washington's credit, and to Jefferson's shame, Washington actually freed his slaves in his will.
It's what I understand.
He did not free Martha's slaves, they were owned by her. Jefferson never did that. And then I'll tell you another kind of interesting story along that line. Anybody ever been to the Alamo in San Antonio?
Yes.
I've been about 3 times over maybe a 45-year period, okay, and I don't know what they do right now, but and it's a private entity, by the way. I think it's actually owned and run by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas.
It's tiny. It's tiny that
It's not
you
very
don't
big.
think it's.
The actual
You think it's
chapel.
big.
Yeah, well, we
big,
saw
you
John
know.
Wayne, his portrayal of Baby
Have you
Cross.
been there?
Also.
I've seen it.
He did not die swinging on Betsy on the parapets. He actually got captured, was executed and burned with the rest of the folks that, that sat there. But I remember even years ago being fascinated going to the Alamo. So you get this heroic story of, fighting for freedom and so on. In those days, and it may have changed, but in those days, they never mentioned the fact that one of the principal reasons why the Texans rebelled from Mexico is because Mexico had abolished slavery and passed a law saying we're not going to allow anybody to bring any more slaves into Texas. Now, they didn't bother to tell you that. So it turns the historian. A lot of people say, well, why be so nitpicky? Well, it's part of the truth, and it's part of the truth that, like the Indian experience, is often washed out or ignored. And as I said before, really until about the 1960s, almost everybody, except elites and political leaders and kings and queens and presidents, was pretty much washed out, with a few exceptions. Okay, and that's when we began to say, well, wait a minute, working classes had a history, and we can actually recover that history. Women, for a while when they first started doing women's history, it was like, well, Susan B. Anthony was great, she did such and such, or Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman doctor in America, or so on and so on. It was like great accomplishments. And they did that with African Americans too. But we now study women and gender as full participants in the story and the narrative, and not just something that happened to them, but actors. In the same way is true with, you know, African Americans and others. That was really, and that really corresponds to sort of, I didn't have anything to do with it, it corresponds to the time I've been in the profession.
And the suffragette movement also was
Oh, yeah.
going on in conjunction with other historical
Absolutely.
things.
In
and
fact, it was usually a
was
battle. I mean,
gone.
one of the big splits that occurred
Yeah.
was you had different groups of abolitionists in the period before the Civil War. And some of these reformers thought you should get involved in a series of different reforms,
Yeah.
whether it be abolitionism or women's rights. Other abolitionists said, no, we don't want to dilute our abolitionist stuff, so we're going to not deal with women's rights. And so there was a split in the abolitionist movement as a result of that. Here's a little tidbit most people are unaware of. Susan B. Anthony and some of the other suffragists were outraged during Reconstruction when Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. 14th Amendment supposedly guarantees, you know, a Republican form of government, which means equal participation, voting, and so on. 15th Amendment obviously says you can't deny anyone the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Susan B. Anthony and others pushed for, lobbied for inclusion in both the 14th and 15th Amendment women. Congress did not do that.
Right.
Susan B. Anthony and others were outraged they would have the audacity to give ignorant black men the right to vote, but not white women. So,
Well, they had
so
been
there's elements of
looking for-
racism all over the place. You know?
Well, it was kind of an oxymoron, it's nuts.
Yeah.
But, and they had been working for 50 years.
Well, it would be
back
another 50
then.
years before they'd get it,
Yeah,
1920.
yeah. That was another Ken Burns
Mhm,
film
yeah.
about women and the vote that has not been as popular.
Yeah.
But I would assume with his integrity, it would have been pretty much.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that one. He's got a new one coming out
I
in
know, it's
September.
only appeared like one time when it
Yeah.
first came out.
He got another one coming out on Vietnam in September, which I very much wanted to see. I've been waiting for it for 2 or 3 years. But as it happened, I'm going to be out of the country that week. I think I'm going to show it consecutive nights, so I'll have to wait for the rerun, I guess. I'm curious. There's an older one made in the 1980s that I always use portions of in my class, which is somewhat dated, but it had the advantage of the fact that they were able to interview people who, you know, are dead now. And so I used some of them. So I'm really very interested to see how Burns deals with Vietnam, because that's a tough one to deal with. And, you know, the other thing about history is, given the epic scope of it, there is really not a really great movie about the American Civil War. I mean, Gone with the Wind is a great movie cinematographically, not a great movie historically. The closest you get to what I would regard as, you know, a pretty accurate movie is Glory, which is about the 54th Infantry, African American infantry from 54th Massachusetts, and that's pretty accurate. But there's no real big, you know, epic or even big good, you know, movie about the Civil War. And I don't know for sure why that's true, except that I think filmmakers, who obviously are very interested in the bottom line, figure they don't know how to do it without offending half the country. Now, interestingly enough, anybody here watch Game of Thrones?
Mm-hmm.
Do you? I've never seen it.
A little bit.
Well, the people who are writing, the writers of Game of Thrones, HBO has now signed them up to do a new series called Confederates or Confederacy, I can't remember. And there's a lot of criticism of this, because the premise is that the Confederates won the war, Civil War, and established the right to be independent. And the premise is, looking at it into the 20th century, slavery still exists in the 20th century. There's a demilitarized zone, you know, I suppose along the Mason-Dixon lane or something. And this is just announced last week, actually. And some people say, well, how are they gonna do this, first of all? I mean, and doesn't this just play into some of the mythology also? I don't know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there've been alternative histories. What's that one now that's showing on one of the cable networks about the Nazis actually took over?
Man in the High Castle.
Yeah, Men in the High Castle. I've never seen that one either. You know, you can play around with that, and I guess it's fun. But I do worry a little. I mean, I'd really rather see some accurate history being portrayed on the cable channels. The History Channel, for example, is absurd. You know, it actually started out pretty good, and there were some real historians actually involved in that. But I can't remember. I haven't even turned it on anymore because it's just nonsense. It's you know, ice truckers in Alaska, or you know, I don't know. I don't even know what the hell it is. It's not history.
Ghost hunting and.
I think they ran out of World War II documentaries. That was kind of. Thank you.
That's where I have to go.
All right, take care. Bye-bye. So I don't know. It's,
Have you played around any with like going back much further and a crossover between history and mythology? I'm thinking about things like the Norse epics, you know, Leif Erikson and that kind of thing, where I guess it turns out that some of those things that were previously thought to be mythology, turns out they may
Well,
have some
there's no
actual
question.
historical
There's no
evidence.
question that there were Europeans that preceded Columbus to the New World, and you know, Eric the Red, I guess it was. I don't remember, but they actually found remains in some places of temporary settlements in Newfoundland and places like that. So there's not much doubt. I mean, you know, when you get into the business of fake history or misunderstood history, it's just endless. I mean, that's what I finally realized after I agreed to do this. I said, oh my God. For example, no educated person in Europe in 1492 believed the world was flat. Just nonsense. Nobody, probably even less educated, nobody believed that. That's the way I learned it. You know, Columbus's crew was scared they were going to fall off the edge. Just nonsense. Columbus knew better. Almost, you know, any educated person at all in Europe knew the earth was flat in 1492. Exactly where that started, I don't know.
Why did they keep on pushing it so much?
I don't know.